Okay, so this is the story of my great grandmother's chocolate pie, and the recipe was passed down to my grandmother. And I am pulling up the recipe on my notes app because when I was 11 or 12 years old, um, I wrote down the recipe because it was found. My mom and I found it in an old Musgrove. Well, my aunt Christine found for us. She lives with my grandmother. Um, a recipe book of the Musgroves and found the chocolate pie recipe because I wanted to make a pie for a holiday. And so um, we made it, and because my grandmother has Alzheimer's, it was very special to ask her questions like, how many eggs exactly are we supposed to have in, and her like actually have the answer. And this would be my favorite type of pie, and so anytime I cook this recipe, I feel connected to my family, but I really feel connected to my grandmother's memory. So the first thing you do when you gotta make a pie is you gotta think about the pie crust. And so I like to make my own pie crust. It's kind of a chaos. This is kind of a chaos pie. It kind of turns out more like a pudding in a shell more than like your classic chocolate pie, which is kind of like a moussey, or a lot of people know it to be cold, but I cook it as a hot pie. So the pie crust is you're gonna have, this is for, just so you know, like this recipe is for making two pies. Um, and so, yeah, so pie crust, you're gonna want, well, this is a pie crust for one pie. You're gonna want a cup of flour and a third cup of shortening, um, and 3 teaspoons of ice water. And what you're gonna do is mix together the flour. I'm kind of going off from memory now. If you can tell, I'm not reading from my screen. You're gonna mix together the flour and the margarine or the shortening or the butter, whatever you prefer to use. And you're gonna make sure, my aunts taught me that putting ice in the third cup measuring of water, keeping in the fridge while you're kind of mixing together the flour and the shortening, and then you're kind of sprinkling in the ice water as it goes until it gets like not too sticky. You don't want it to be too sticky, because then it won't roll out well, but just enough so that it forms into a nice, like my aunts and my mom would always say, hockey puck. And then you wrap it up in like wax paper and put it in the freezer for when you're ready to bake the pie all together. So then the fun part, you got to make the pudding. And so when you're making the pie pudding, basically it's very simple. You're taking all the dry ingredients and mixing them together, and then all of the wet ingredients like the eggs, and the milk, and then you're going to mix them all together and boil them, and the boiling is what takes a long time. And so for 2 chocolate pies and the pudding for them, the wet ingredients you need 4 egg yolks. So that means you're going to crack an egg. Oh, I just dropped the you're going to crack an egg and then separate the yolk from the egg white. And I crack it and then I pour it back and forth, and I pour the egg white into a bowl, which I pass aside later to do the meringue with. And then you mix together the egg yolks and the milk, and you beat them together in a heavy pan. And this is usually the heavy pan that we use for boiling, so I just get like kind of a big size metal pan, mix together those things and set them on the side, usually on the stove, and then mix together the dry ingredients. And so for the dry ingredients, you need 2 cups of sugar, 8 tablespoons of flour, 4 tablespoons of cocoa powder, and you're going to mix them together. We like to use a sifter, so we sift together all, then we crank and crank and crank and crank until it's all in, and then you just start mixing. And usually this takes like 30, maybe 45 minutes of mixing it over medium heat until it boils. And my aunts always say, I would be cooking in the kitchen in like middle school and stuff, and I'd be like, oh my god, when is it gonna boil, to the point where I'd have a stool up by the stove because my back would start hurting. And they'd say, a watch pot never boils, and I'd be like, well, but you have to keep stirring, so what else is there to do but watch it? Which is kind of funny. It's nice to have patience. But once it starts boiling, it starts to do these like thick bubbles, like kind of like a swamp, which I don't know if it's interesting to talk about swamps while cooking, kind of not the smell you would want maybe, but you stir it together and you cook over low heat until it comes to a low boil. And you're going to cook it until it's really thick. And once it starts boiling, you want to keep mixing it for at least 3 minutes. And this is to kill the flour taste. And then after that, you're going to turn off the heat. It's important to put in the vanilla at the very end once it's all boiled. And you need 3 teaspoons of vanilla. And then you're going to beat it until there are no more lumps. And then after that, you make the meringue. And I'm forgetting exactly how much sugar you need, but the egg whites that you toss aside at the end, you mix it together. We use just like a mixer of the egg whites, some sugar, and some cream of tartar. And it makes that like fluffy mixture that when you like put a fork, like the back of a fork on it, or a spoon, it makes peaks. But before that, you have your pie crust, you've rolled it out, you've put it in a pan and done the cool thing where you like take your fingers and put on the sides and make that like shape, that cool like shell shape. And then you have that and you bake the pie crust for like 10 minutes. And then you pour in the chocolate pudding and you bake it for like 15, or actually, just kidding, you don't bake it, you bake the crust. It's so funny to do this from memory and to not actually just be doing it right now. You bake the crust 10 to 15 minutes until it's golden brown, and then you just pour the pudding in, and you hopefully have the meringue made now, and then you just put it on top and you peek it with the spoon, and then bam, you got like this warm chocolate pudding pie, and it is amazing and wonderful.